I call Keith Locke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Green Party will be supporting this bill to Select Committee, and will be interested to see the submissions at the Select Committee level, because it is a somewhat puzzling bill. As the speakers have said, it's a very short bill and adds an aggravating factor to a number of aggravating factors that judges have to take into account in sentencing, but as has been pointed out, they already do so, and it's clear that police officers and prison officers do put themselves in harm's way for our good, and I think judges always take into consideration that fact and try and, as best they can, protect police officers and discourage people from committing offences, particularly assaults, against them. There's already some provisions in the Crimes Act and Summary Offences Act in relation to assaults on police officers, with provisions under the Summary Offences Act. Assaults on police officers carry a maximum penalty of 6 months imprisonment, and also under the Crimes Act a maximum of 14 years imprisonment for using a firearm against any police, traffic or prison officer, and a maximum of 3 years imprisonment for the aggravated assault on a constable in the execution of their duty. So there's some provisions there already. It probably would have been a better course if the government really thinks they need to add that if the victim is a constable or a prison officer acting in the course of his or her duty, that needs to be added to the aggravating factors in the Crimes Act that the judge takes account of during sentencing. But it could have been put in a bigger bill instead of going through all the hassle. And as even the regulatory impact statement indicates, this is a fairly meaningless extra provision, and it'd be very hard to test whether in fact what we're voting on here, and if it goes through to the third reading, what we're voting on as a parliament, it's very hard to test what impact it will have on sentencing, if any. To quote from the regulatory impact statement issued by the Acting General Manager, Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, Malcolm Louis, the proposed amendment will not require the court to take any specific action in terms of the type or severity of sentence imposed. The court will be required to take this factor into account, along with other specified and unspecified aggravating factors, in arriving at the appropriate sentence to be imposed in a particular case. Because judges' assessment of aggravating and mitigating factors are not amenable to empirical analysis, and the proposed amendment does not entail specific action by the court, no monitoring or evaluation of the proposed amendment is possible." End quote. So we're left a bit up in the air about the effect of this. And if you do look at the existing provision under the Sentencing Act 2002, in terms of the aggravating factors, they're pretty common sense ones that judges would take into account anyhow, that whether the offence involved actual or threatened violence or the actual or threatened use of a weapon, obviously you take that into account. Whether it involved unlawful entry or unlawful presence in a dwelling house, sort of crime, house invasion, obviously you take into account. Whether the offender was on bail, judges take that into account every day. Whether there's particular cruelty, abusing a position of trust, whether the victim was particularly vulnerable because of age, health, or health, if they're disabled, etc. Clearly, judges take that into account. If it involves, I suppose this next one is a relevant one to put in there in that particular section of the Sentencing Act, that if the offender committed the offence partly or wholly because of hostility towards a group of persons who have the same characteristics, race, character, nationality, gender identity, sexual orientation, age or disability. I think it's good to single that one out because we don't want the cancer of prejudice extending and expanding in our society, so that's quite a good one. Whether the offence involved a terrorist act, that's an obvious one to put in. Whether the person was part of an organised criminal group, whether there was premeditation, or the nature and extent of previous conviction. Those are obvious things to put in as aggravating factors. There's nothing particularly wrong, I suppose, with adding whether the offence was committed on a police or prison officer, but we're not really adding a great deal to the law by doing that. There is the other side of this it's worth commenting on, that the adding of this as an aggravating factor and the other provisions in the Crimes Act and Summary Offences Act about an extra penalty for assaults on officers in the pursuit of their duty. The other side of that is that police officers have to take particular care not to misuse that provision of an extra sentence, because you do sometimes hear complaints from people who are up before the courts and sometimes from lawyers defending them that the charge of an assault on a constable has been unnecessarily put on the... Well, often there's a grey area between obstruction of police officers, resisting arrest and assault on a police officer. And if there's going to be an extra charge, an extra sentence, a significant sentence on assault on a constable, the police officers have got to be careful they don't say, if they happen to be a bit prejudiced to somebody, we'll slap the charge of assault on them rather than a lesser charge of obstructing the police officer or resisting arrest. That just... I think that's on the other side of the equation. If Parliament's going to protect police officers and prison officers in this way, which we think is a good thing, then there's an extra responsibility on the police officers and prison officers not to misuse that provision. So with those few words, the Green Party will be interested in the discussion at the Select Committee and see what the experts, particularly the legal experts and law societies and whatnot in this field, say about this particular additional provision in this massive bill here of less than a page, really. Thanks.